This is hell.
When we want a clear reading of the impact that neoliberalism is having on our planet, we always turn to our next guest. Whether it's the racial violence that killed George Floyd or it's the violence to our environment that led to the global pandemic, you can count on it all going back to the cruel system of neoliberalism, returning to This Is Hell to explain cultural critic, writer, university professor, journalist, and a member of the board of directors for Truth Out, Henry A. Giroux. Henry, how are you?
Good. Chuck, how you feeling? Hope you're better.
My stomach is better. I might be having a little bit of a relapse today, but it's feeling better. How are you feeling?
Oh, I'm okay. I'm fine.
So you never got coronavirus? Nothing like that?
No. I can't get it because I have an autoimmune problem, so I have to be very careful.
So are you being super careful, staying indoors and doing all the precautions you need to do?
Doing all the things I need to do, just reading and writing.
Excellent. And I've been reading your writing, so that's perfect. In an article at Counterpunch, Racial Domestic Terrorism and the Legacy of State Violence, you write that the sheer brutality of George Floyd's death at the hands of a viciously violent cop symbolizes the unadulterated racism of a culture that looks away in the face of police violence against black people, but also a society in which a form of racialized domestic terrorism has become normalized. You see this as terrorism. President Trump sees Antifa, not white supremacist groups who have a long history, a long record of hate crimes and violence in the United States, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. He views Antifa as terrorists, not the white supremacists. What does it reveal to you about the Trump administration or U.S. governance more generally, even beyond the Trump administration, when the actions of police are not seen as terrorism, but anti-fascists are seen as terrorists?
I mean, I think that what we see is what we've seen for the last 4 years with Trump. And I think that we see a guy who basically wants to militarize every possible space that he can in order to concentrate power ruthlessly, not only in his own hands, but in the hands of basically his racist, white supremacist, neo-fascist followers. I mean, Trump only knows the language of violence. He only knows the language of self-absorption and greed and self-interest. And he has a propensity to label anything, whether it's oppositional language, whether it's oppositional journalists, or whether it's people who are basically suffering in the face of state violence as terrorists, when in fact he's the real terrorist. I mean, what he's doing is through his policies, whether they're on the border dealing with immigration, with undocumented immigrants and putting children in cages, or whether he's telling the police to become more thug-like in dealing with people that they arrest, which of course is generally poor black and brown people, or whether he's basically enacting policies that destroy the environment. I mean, these are all acts of violence, and I think that what we have to ask ourselves is, what's the thread that connects all of these? Because we're not just talking about racism. We're talking about massive inequality. We're talking about the financialization of the economy. We're talking about xenophobia in a way unlike we've seen in a long time. We're talking about ultranationalism. I mean, these are all part of a basically what I call the logic of neoliberal fascism. I mean, it's misery basically conjoined with terror, conjoined and connected with what I call racial sorting.
So during the Obama administration, we did hear a lot of Republicans, especially those on the far right, like the Fox News kind of far right. They were all complaining about the potential for totalitarianism, authoritarianism, even the potential for martial law under the Barack Obama administration. And now we hear President Trump calling for, as you were saying, a militarized response, not only to coronavirus, but also to the killing of George Floyd. What explains to you why the far right would be so afraid of martial law under one leadership and then call for martial law under another leadership?
I mean, these are all diversions. I mean, anything the far right media says basically is the product of both their own political and economic interest, which aligns with Trump's, and the fact that they're sycophants. I mean, this is pure propaganda. There's no journalism involved here. I mean, let's recognize what we're dealing with. We're dealing with cultural apparatuses that are basically in the hands of the state, and they will say anything to basically defend their faceless leader. I don't take them. I take them seriously in terms of certainly the influence that they have in general in persuading people to believe in either hating themselves or acting according to interests that are not in their interest, or in fact, helping to consolidate the rule of and the power of the ruling elites. But to look for contradictions in what they say is to believe that at some level there's a logic there that simply has to be exposed. It isn't about logic, it's about power. I mean, these groups are basically nothing more than legitimating tools. They're disimagination machines. They sow divisiveness. They claim that the pandemic was a joke designed to basically not get Trump reelected. When they look at terror, all they look at are people who basically are fighting for their lives in order to survive. I mean, everything is Orwellian. This is the ministry of falsehoods. That's what it is. And I think, certainly we need to expose those lies, but I think what we really need to recognize is who they are. They're nothing more than adjuncts of really the consolidation of neoliberal fascist power. That's all they are. They can't be trusted. They should be condemned. And I think we need to fight for alternative medias like This Is Hell that basically expose them and point out options that are more viable and are willing to sort of understand the conditions that give rise to them. I'm more concerned about where they come from and how they're funded and whose interests they serve than I am in looking at the contradictions that emerge from the discourse that comes out of their idiotic mouths every day.
In your writing on the coronavirus, you write, the other plague among many is the rise of right-wing cultural apparatuses such as Fox News and Breitbart Media, in which truth is treated with scorn, science viewed as a hindrance, and critical thought is maligned as fake news. This is a plague of willful ignorance and state-sanctioned civic illiteracy. Willful ignorance. Why would anyone will themselves into ignorance? And can that happen on both the right and the left?
I think it certainly can happen on both the right and the left. There are no political guarantees just because one operates from a particular ideological position. But it seems to me that we do want to recognize that people on the left basically operate from the position that they're talking about social justice. They're talking about equality. They're talking about, in some way, making the world a better place. Some of them slide into political purity. Some of them might distort the truth in some ways. On the other hand, on the right, you're not talking about people who basically have a vision of a better society. You're talking about people who basically want to justify inequality. You're talking about people who are justifying racism. You're talking about people who are justifying racial violence and state violence. You're talking about people who basically want and justify the destruction of the environment. You're talking about a death machine. So these are very different groups. So let's begin, first of all, with where they start from in order to begin to understand that this is a false equivalence to say that the left lies and the right lies. I think that's just nonsense. I think the other side of this, that what is nonsense is the question. The other side of this is that let's look at who has the power in this country. Think about the president's comment about Antifa. Is he serious? Does he really believe that hundreds of thousands of people mobilizing in the streets of over 40 cities in the United States is organized by Antifa? That borders on believing in the virgin birth, and in angels. Sorry, I don't mean to offend evangelicals here, but at the same time, these are such distortions of the truth that we really have to start asking ourselves, what is being defended here? What's the root of this problem? Outside of the question of whether the truth is being maligned. Of course the truth is being maligned, but the truth is always maligned for a particular purpose, so that when you ask me, why would they engage in willful ignorance, there's two kinds of ignorances, it seems to me. There's the ignorance of just not knowing, and then there's a willful ignorance, which is basically the refusal to know so that you can reproduce your own particular interest, and in this case, in the interest of power.
One of the things that's really been bugging me about the coverage of the protests against the police violence that ended up killing George Floyd is that some who are supporting the cops will just say, hey, look, it's just a few bad apples. And then when it comes to the looters, who might just be a few bad apples, those looters completely undermine the entire movement against police violence. The focus in the media and much of the public discussion and debate is now on the looting without deeper conversations and analysis on racial violence imposed by the police. Why does...
No, that's very eloquent and of course very smart. And I think there are three issues here.
Okay.
I mean, one, if we're going to talk about looting, let's put it in a context that gives the term some substance. And what that means is that you have corporations, you have banks, you have hedge funds, you have policies that basically loot from the American public and basically push whatever funds we have upward into the hands of relatively few people. That's real looting. If you want to look at the financial crisis of 2008, that's looting. We basically cheated people out of their homes. We gave them the banks gave them false mortgages, and it goes on and on. Or we do have tax breaks, $1.5 trillion that go to the rich. We have a pandemic bill that basically serves billionaires and millionaires and does almost nothing for small business owners. That's looting. If we're going to talk about looting, that's looting. Secondly, looting is code. It's code for basically a form of racism. When we talk about looters in the media, what we're talking about generally are poor people who are stealing televisions from Target. That's basically what's going on here. There's a refusal to really think through what that term means. Thirdly, the tactic is a diversion. To talk about looting and not talk about the conditions that produce it is to miss the point. Now, fourthly, it seems to me there's another argument, and that argument is that there are many people basically who are involved in the protest who are nonviolent and are saying, hey, look, this is a diversion. We don't support this, and we have to think through how we're going to handle this, while at the same time not condemning everybody who doesn't get involved in this sort of thing. I mean, we have to talk about it not simply as a moral issue, but as a strategic issue. It's not beneficial. It's just not beneficial, it seems to me, because it offers too many opportunities for a law and order president to emerge beating his chest and to do a photo op by gassing people beforehand and then walking, of all places, to a church and, of all things, holding up a Bible. I mean, Donald Trump holding up a Bible and then talking about how he really likes protesters and loves black people. So it seems to me that these terms, when they get seized upon so quickly, especially by the mainstream press, they're really supporting, to say the very least, the kind of law and order that they think they're reacting against.
We were talking to Ariella Aisha Azaleh yesterday about her book, Potential Histories, Unlearning Imperialism. And she was talking about how, for instance, Palestine in 1947, Arabs and Jews were working together trying to find a peaceful solution, and that was overrun by imperialism. So she said we need to go back to those moments, and we have to remember those moments in time. You write that people running into stores taking TVs are labeled looters when, in fact, as James Baldwin once said, captive populations don't loot. Hedge fund managers, bankers, pharmaceutical executives, big corporations, and the rest of the ultra-rich are the real looters.
Look, let's be realistic here. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's one thing that has to be said.
Okay.
If we're going to talk about looting as a destruction of property and not talk about looting as a destruction of human life,
right,
we're missing the point. And it seems to me that if you want to talk about looting, think about the pharmaceutical companies in the last 5 years. And think about how many people died because they purposely flooded the market with opioids, knowing that those drugs would kill people, and at the same time did it and raked in millions and millions of dollars. That's looting. Were they put in jail? Were they described as criminals? No, not really. I mean, if we want to talk about, let's put this in a context that makes sense.
And I heard this, the comment that you made, that you quote of James Baldwin, I heard this attributed by a TV reporter in the last week who is trying to represent this point of view. I heard this attributed to, quote, young people today. How dependent is the history of racial violence on the erasing of voices and movements against police violence that have risen up in the past, just like we see the erasing of the stories against imperialism that happened, for instance, back in 1947 Palestine? I
mean, we're not just talking about the erasure of oppressive events that basically we should learn from in terms of trying to understand the genesis and the origins. We're talking about the erasure and the reconfiguration of historical memory in general. I mean, you live in a culture of immediacy. You live in a culture for which history is the enemy. You know, you live in a culture in which historical memory seems like a term that belongs in some sort of academic textbook and is not really part of the pedagogical practices that are necessary for people to become critically engaged citizens. I mean, we're talking here not simply about the crisis of history, we're talking about the crisis of agency. And it seems to me that people cannot be agents if they don't have a sense of history. They cannot be agents if they don't understand the connections between what's going on now and what's happened in the past. If you can't connect the kind of violence that's going in the streets right now to 1968, if you can't connect that to Jim Crow, if you can't connect that to the rise of capital punishment in the United States, if you can't connect that to the origins of slavery, if you can't connect that to the genocide waged against Native Americans, you don't get it. You don't have an understanding. All you can hear is a president stand in front of a church making a phony speech about how we need law and order, without any sense of how that term has been used basically as a weapon to weaponize language and to basically kill people.
You write that under the Trump regime, people of color are thugs, relegated to zones of social abandonment, lacking human rights, and unknowable as lives worthy of value. Is that knowing that their lives are unknowable as lives worthy of value, is that simply a mechanism of neoliberalism, capitalism, imperialism to have a labor force who are viewed as lacking value so others can benefit from their poorly rewarded work? Is that just the way that capitalism works?
Go back and listen to the speeches of Malcolm X if you want to answer that question, if you really want an answer to that question. I mean, it seems to me that one of the things that capitalism does is it basically says that whatever strengths working class people have, whatever strengths black people have, whatever strengths brown people have, whatever strengths the oppressed have, are really not strengths, they're deficits. And they should be ashamed that basically their lives are worthless. That basically, if they're not good consumers, they have no identity. Their histories don't matter. The schools attempt to eliminate those histories. Arizona attempted to wipe out in the textbooks the history of Mexican-American families for their children. So it seems to me that when you undermine the possibility for people to speak, to be voiceless is to be powerless. When you undermine and eliminate the narratives that give people a sense of their histories, that's a form of depoliticization. It's not just an attack on their self-esteem. I mean, it's a way of refiguring history in the way so as to suggest that the only people worthy of history are white people. The only people worthy of history are the rich. The only people worthy of history are the Donald Trumps. The only heroes we have today are basically the head of tech companies, the CEOs. So it seems to me that this crisis of historical memory is also about the crisis of agency, and it's also fundamentally about the crisis of politics and democracy. And do we need to learn those histories? Absolutely. Do we need, in some fundamental way, to be able to define ourselves so as to be able to think through who we are and what our strengths are? I have a term for that. Because, as a working class kid, I was defined by my deficits. Oh, you're too emotional, you're too kinetic, you're too passionate, and that kind of nonsense. And I called it flipping the script. And what that means is that at some point I recognized that the things that I was told to emulate in middle class and ruling class values were really despicable. And once I was able to flip that script, I understood that I came from a neighborhood where there was an enormous sense of solidarity among working class kids, that we hung together, that we had a sense of ethical responsibility. And there were all kinds of things that basically gave us a sense of community. And so I think the key here is how do you flip the script against those kinds of dominant historical narratives?
And if you haven't figured out why Henry is one of my very favorite guests on the show so far during our conversation, then you're not listening. We are speaking with cultural critic, writer, university professor, journalist, and a member of the board of directors for Truth Out, Henry A. Giroux. You can find out more about Henry at his website, Henry A. Giroux. Follow Henry on Twitter at Henry Giroux. You write, no one talks about the roots of these problems, and I do not simply mean their origins in slavery, a culture of lynching, and a deeply ingrained institutional racism, however crucial these events are. I am talking about the roots of a fascist politics in which money counts more than people And some people count more than others. So we heard all of these people on the right being very concerned about the cure for the coronavirus might be worse than the disease. The actual shutting down of the economy might be worse than the actual pandemic. They wanted to put profits before people instead of people before profits. Does putting the economy before the people, is that the definition of fascism?
You know, maybe it was Horkheimer. It was Horkheimer. Horkheimer once said that Max Horkheimer was a member of the Frankfurt School. You know, when he was studying fascism, he had a great line, Chuck. He said, if you don't want to talk about capitalism, you can't talk about fascism. And I think he's absolutely right, because it seems to me that what we've seen in the evolution of capitalism over the last 40 years, particularly since the election of Ronald Reagan, what we have seen is that it's become more severe, it's become more extreme, it's become more savage, and it's become more cruel. And I say that because what that basically means is it can no longer defend itself. It can no longer say, we're about social mobility, we're about trickle-down economics, we're going to rise people up from the bottom to the top. Those things are just lies, and they're gone. So now it's turned to something else. It says the real problems, of course, are about black people. The real problems about people, mobilizing in the streets. I don't use the word riots. I say rebellions. People are rebelling in the street, but they don't use that term. The real problem is that we've defunded education. The real problem is that people are suffering because they're in debt and afraid to access health care because they're afraid that they won't be able to pay back what the fees are. People are dying because they don't have enough food. People are dying because the economy has been financialized and there are no productive jobs anymore. People are dying because 1 in 4 people in America don't have jobs right now. People are dying because 45% of those jobs won't come back. I mean, so it seems to me when you close down the future in the name of an economic system, and then in the face of the misery it produces, say that the economy is worth some people dying, what you see is a neoliberal fascism that actually is tying itself to the logic of genocide. I mean, think about what was said in the pandemic about older people. Oh, they can go. We don't need them. Their lives are expendable. What really matters is keeping the economy alive. That is a false choice. And it's not to say the economy doesn't matter. It says that if you had a democratic socialist government that basically took half the funds they put in the military and provide people with the funds that they need to survive and more, while at the same time investing in health, investing in schools, and investing in public goods, while at the same time doing everything you can to address this vaccine, there is no dichotomy. The economy will come back. People will work. You'll have national health care. You'll be able to address the problems that you have. So the notion that the economy is more important than human life is really an argument for a form of neoliberal fascism. That's a false argument. The other side of this is that it's now become so brutalized and so cruel and so obvious and so visible that it makes no apologies for actually claiming that some people should die so that whatever it is, the gross national product can go up in the stock market, can revive itself. Can you imagine?
The media and the government at the beginning of the response here in the U.S. kept saying we are all in this together, and a repeated call for unity in this time of crisis under the virus. Has that contradiction been revealed as unsustainable?
It's such a false language. I remember riding down the highway, and there was a big billboard put out by General Electric. It said, "Pick up the trash. We're all in this together." Well, actually, no, I'm afraid we're not all in this together.
I can't believe that, Henry. That is outstanding. That is amazing. That is such hubris.
Some people have power and contribute in an enormously inordinate way to destroying the environment. My putting my trash in the green bin is not the same as corporations dumping millions of pollutants into the waterways, crippling kids, putting lead in the water in Flint and other cities, having schools where there are cockroaches running around and kids are being exposed to that, cutting back on food stamps so that people basically get sick and don't have access to health care. I'm sorry. When you really want to talk about 3 families in the United States controlling as much as 50% of the bottom of the population in wealth, hence and in power, don't say that we're all in this together. We're not all in this together. Some of us are victims. Some of us are in this because we have no choice. some of us don't have the capabilities or the possibilities because we're struggling to survive to even address those problems. So that's a false unity that is as bad as the neoliberal argument that the only responsibility one has is to oneself, and that the only way in which one can address any problem is to blame oneself. It's just a horrendously cruel and, it seems to me, false argument.
It's a very false argument, and you write that neoliberal capitalism is the underlying pandemic feeding the current global shortage of hospitals, medical supplies, beds, and robust social welfare provisions, and increasingly an indifference to human life. Here in Chicago, right in my neighborhood, there was a completely closed down hospital that they started tearing down at the beginning of the coronavirus. Why is the question of why there is a global shortage of hospitals, medical supplies, beds, and social welfare not being asked? That you would think that would be the conversation on the very first day of them saying, hey, we have a shortage of beds. You'd think, well, why do we have a shortage of beds? Because we have a shortage of hospitals. Why do we have a shortage of hospitals? Because there was a political choice made to close down health facilities that were needed. Why is that question not being investigated in any way?
It's not being investigated, Chuck, because it's too dangerous. Because it's a question that exposes the very heart of a savage kind of capitalism, which believes that the market should control and govern all of social life, and that therefore the social contract is a nemesis, that democracy is the enemy, that public goods basically should not be supported, that people who get anything in terms of the public good are somehow moochers, are somehow greedy and stupid, and really don't deserve that we all have to sort of pick ourselves up by the bootstraps. And if we want good health care, we have to fight for it alone and prove that we're worthy of it. It's such a savage, this is such a savage argument. This hatred of the social contract, this hatred, remember now, this hatred of equality translates into a massive endorsement of inequality. This hatred of compassion translates into a culture of enormous cruelty. This refusal to deal with the language that supports community and democracy translates into a language of divisiveness. This othering people because of their color, because of their class, because of their race, because of their sexual orientation translates into the language of hate. And the language of hate translates into the language of violence.
But Henry, we got lower taxes out of the whole deal, right? So this worked out perfectly, right? So why don't we make that connection to the fact that it was this huge anti-tax movement starting in 1980, and if not beforehand, that has led to this crisis of neoliberalism?
That crisis emerged out of the presupposition that it's better to protect your own interests and to see government as the enemy than basically to be able to support a public good in which everybody benefits. That's where that came from. Just as Thatcher said, there's no such thing as society. They're only individuals, and government. And of course, Reagan said, government is really the enemy. When Reagan and Thatcher got married, they produced something awful. And what they basically produced was an economic system that was really a death machine. It benefited very few people. It hated the social contract. It undermined democracy, and it tore this country apart. And it caused a massive amount of inequality, suffering, and access to goods that everybody should have.
To what degree did we choose that, Henry?
I think that people choose it to the degree to which they're led to believe that the vision of the good society is basically about the vision of self-interest. And I don't blame people for believing that. What I blame are the disimagination machines that spread that narrative endlessly through the logic of consumerism, reality TV, game shows, the dismantling of the public good. Remember, we have been fighting against this ideology since the late 1970s. And the damage that it has done, now we're seeing it explode among young people who are the only hope I think we really have, who are multicultural, who are have multiple identities, who are in the streets and are saying, hey, look, the future, this ideology has canceled out the future. We don't believe it anymore because we have seen what it does to us. We have seen what it does to older people, to poor people, to black people, to brown people. The evidence is there. And I think that when we look back, what we're going to be able to say, I believe, in light of that wonderful question you asked, which I think is really crucial, and that is we saw the failure of education. We just saw the failure of American education. It happened in California. All of a sudden, people are saying, we can no longer raise taxes to a certain limit. The school systems plummeted. We saw it in the failure to take equality seriously, producing massive degrees of human suffering and misery around inequality. And then we saw the government completely taken over by the financial interest. We no longer have a national political government. We have a corporate government. Let's be realistic. And that corporate government does everything it can to constantly reinforce, reproduce, and sustain its own power and logic, which is at odds with 90% of the population.
You write that many people who are and will die as a result of reckless policies towards coronavirus will be those traditionally viewed as disposable under the reign of neoliberalism. These include the elderly, the destitute, poor people of color, undocumented immigrants, and people with disabilities, not to mention the frontline medical workers who lack the equipment they need to be safe as they treat the elderly, sick, and dangerously ill. We're all calling these people essential workers, whether they're grocery store workers or EMTs now. How can essential workers be disposable under neoliberalism? Does that yet again show another fissure in neoliberalism and how it does?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that what this pandemic crisis has done, among other things, just as the rebellions that are taking place in the streets all over the country right now. I mean, what it's made clear is that, I'm sorry, these populations are essential to how the country runs. That all of a sudden the heroes are not the bankers, the heroes are not the hedge fund managers. Nobody's talking about Bill Gates as a hero right now. Give me a break. Jamie Dimon, see you later. I mean, the real heroes are the people who every day go out and put their lives on the line, the people who make the electricity work, the people who nurture the buildings, the people who provide the food, the people who do the jobs that make this country and the rest of the societies all over the world function. And I think we're discovering that. And to me, that's a sign of hope, because it seems to me that let's talk about our priorities. What do we want to invest in? Do we want to invest in the upper 1/10% and shift all our wealth, money, interest, policies, and power to those people? Or do we want to now ask ourselves the question, if we need health care, what should we do? If we need food, what should we do? If we need security for our children, what should we do? What does it mean to hold back a government that basically endorses the police to be thugs and to brutalize black and brown populations? What should we do? So it seems to me a whole range of questions that have come out of this fissure are enormously important about what kind of society we now want to envision in light of both of these pandemics, these three pandemics we're seeing.
There had already been an epidemic of loneliness and depression sweeping the United States and the UK. What impact do you think not only neoliberalism's language, as you call it, language of isolation, deprivation, human suffering, and death, but its outcomes of those very things, has on the ability of the U.S. or UK public to emotionally and psychologically deal with quarantine? What impact does neoliberalism have?
I think it makes it very difficult. I mean, loneliness and social atomization, if I can put it this way, echoing Hannah Arendt, is a form of terrorism. It's a form of terrorism. When you separate people, when you break down communities, when you force people to simply think about surviving and nothing else, when you say the language of compassion is a disease, when you say that the very notion of community is something that we have to break up and destroy any solidarity in the interest of pushing a particular neoliberal ideology, it seems to me that that's really horrendous. And people suffer from that. I mean, we're social beings. We need to function in a way that allows us to work together, to be cooperative. We need a society of shared responsibilities, not a society based on shared fears. And that's exactly what we have, a society based on divisiveness, self-interest, shared fears. It doesn't work. I mean, it produces anxiety, it produces precarity, it produces fear, it produces loneliness, but it also produces something else. It produces a hatred for other people. And it seems to me that it's a terrible, dangerous ideology that really fosters an enormous collective fascism.
So, Henry, a lot of people are saying that, well, if we just elect Joe Biden, everything's going to get better. Sure, it'll get better. But is Joe Biden the answer to all of the problems that we're having, whether it's coronavirus or racial violence?
Look, I have two positions on this. The first is there's what I call immediate reforms, and then there's what I call absolutely long-term change. In the most immediate sense, we've got to get rid of Donald Trump. He's dangerous. He's a fascist. He's one, as my friend Noam Chomsky has argued, he's one of the most dangerous people in the world right now. We have to get rid of him. Is Joe Biden the answer? Absolutely not, because Joe Biden is part of a Democratic Party that basically helped to produce people like Trump. We need a third party. We have to work. Capitalism and democracy, as I've said before in this program, are not the same thing. We don't need reform. We need change. We need massive transformative change. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but we have to be able to envision a society that is not simply a reform of this society, but is entirely different. And I think it's happening. Look what Bernie Sanders did. All of a sudden, he invented the term socialism and made it legitimate. We're talking about policies that are basically socialist policies. So it seems to me that, no, Biden, absolutely not. Biden is a member of the establishment. Biden is Hillary Clinton light. We don't need that. What we need if Biden gets in is to really push the limits of that kind of politics so that we can refigure radical change rather than simply reform.
And that's what we were arguing. We had, was it Frances Moore LePay? I can't remember who was on the show, who was talking about this back in 2008, in December 2008. She was talking about how we need to push the Barack Obama administration to make certain that it lives up to the ideals that a lot of the anti-war activists had that had helped him get into office. And then immediately upon getting into office, you heard Democrats from everywhere saying, you cannot push him too far to the left or he'll be a one-term president. What happened? How can we make certain that we do have the people who are pressuring people like Joe Biden, if they do get into office, to make certain that they do the things we want them to do instead of doing as Barack Obama did, which was a race to the center?
I think what you do is you go in the streets. I think that you're going to put a stop to all of this. And I don't think that's a call for violence. I think that basically it's a call for new strategies that unite different groups in ways that shut the country down. We've got to shut down the power that dominates this country. You want to shut it down? Go for their pocketbooks. Occupy mass civil disobedience. And do what Martin Luther King did. Be selective. Shut down different things in this country at different times. Use those opportunities to educate people. But at the same time, we've got to paralyze the system. The system has to be stopped. And it's not going to be stopped through elections that are a joke. It's not going to happen that way. We need massive education. We need a unified mass movement. And we need strategies that work, that are effective, that all of a sudden that can translate into enormous attention and can make the country, the machinery, come to a halt, if temporarily at times, just so we can make it clear that we cannot go on like this anymore.
So what is our future if once we are allowed to go back outside, if we go back to normal?
The future is not inventing a future that mimics the present. The future is fighting collectively. The future is taking advantage of the energies of young people and bringing it together. The future is about getting rid of the fractions that we see on the left. The future is to talk about a society that is just, equitable, and is serious about democratic participation and basically economic equality and social justice. We need a new language, Chuck. We need a new language. We need educational systems that produce it, radical imagination machines. We need an alternative media, but we need a mass movement that takes the question of education and the question of collective struggle, sees them as inseparable.
We have been speaking with cultural critic, writer, university professor, journalist, and a member of the board of directors for Truth Out, Henry A. Giroux. Find out more about Henry at his website, henryagiroux.com. Follow Henry on Twitter at Henry Giroux. Our final question for you, the question from hell, the question we might hate to ask, you might hate to answer, our audience is going to hate your response, Henry, is our guests on last Monday's show, a couple weeks ago, argued that it is inevitable that neoliberalism will fail under the virus? Can neoliberalism fail as long as the rich are getting ever more rich off of neoliberalism?
Neoliberalism, there's no guarantee that anything will fail unless people wake up and become aware to a process of both critical understanding and critical action about what it means to come together to be able to invent a future that doesn't reproduce the present. So it seems to me that's an enormously political question, because it operates off the assumption that we need a new language, we need new agents, we need a new vision, and we need new possibilities.
God, I love Henry. I love talking to you. You're like absolutely one of my very, very favorite guests. Thank you so much for being back on our show again. Henry was last on back in July of last year. You can find all of our interviews with Henry at our website. Just search on his name, Giroux. Thanks again for being on, Henry. Really, really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Chuck. Thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.